Hi, everyone. I'm Marian Huggins. I'm one of the branch managers of the New Haven Free Public Library, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all to another presentation with our partners at Yale Public Humanities. Tonight's talk is part of the Democracy in America series with Yale University professor Matthew Jacobson, and his guest this evening is Dr. Mia Bay, professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. She and Professor Jacobson will discuss Dr. Bay's new book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance. The book is available for loan right here at the New Haven Free Public Library. It's also available on audio through our Hoopla. And so without any further ado, welcome Dr. Bay, and I'll turn things over to you, Dr. Jacobson.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much to Marian Huggins and our other partners in the New Haven Free Public Library system, Luis Chavez-Bromell, Rory Mordarana, Seth Godfrey, and Isaac Shub. My thanks to my colleague Karen Rothman, who has worked so hard for this series, and our associate Jake Gagne, who not only has worked hard for the series, but is working even now behind the scenes. So thank you to Karen and Jake. Before we begin tonight, on a somber note, I want to pause to mark the passing of the great musician and cultural critic Greg Tate earlier today. Tate wrote for Vibe, Spin, and The Village Voice. He authored several books, including Midnight Lightning on Jimi Hendrix and Flyboy and the Buttermilk, Essays on Contemporary America. And he was a founding member of the Black Rock Coalition and of the band Burnt Sugar. He was also one of the featured voices in this year's documentary sensation, Questlove's Summer of Soul. Tate spoke on the Yale campus on several occasions, including at the Prince and David Bowie conference in 2017. In his creativity, his social commentary, and his tireless political commitments, he was an exemplar of everything that public humanists aspire to be. The Public Humanities at Yale will donate copies of all of Greg Tate's books to the New Haven Free Public Library, and I encourage you to check them out. Our hearts go out to his family tonight and to his many friends and fans. On a much happier note, tonight it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Mia Bay back virtually to New Haven. Mia Bay took her PhD here at Yale and taught for many years at Rutgers before joining the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, where she currently holds the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Chair in American History. Bay's publications include The White Image in the Black Mind, African-American Ideas About White People, 1830 to 1925, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells, and the edited work of Ida B. Wells, The Light of Truth, The Writings of an Anti-Lynching Crusader. She's also the co-author with Waldo Martin and Deborah Gray White of the textbook, Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans with Documents, and the co-editor of two collections of essays, Towards an Intellectual History of Black Women and Race and Retail, Consumption Across the Color Line. Tonight, Mia will be discussing her new book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance. Mia Bay, welcome. It's so great to see you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and happy to be back at Yale and also be back in the New Haven Public Library, which was always one of my favorite spots in New Haven.
It's great to see you. I mean, I wish you were literally here, but we do what we can. So before we start, I just have to say, this new book of yours, Traveling Black, I just believe it is the best book there is on Jim Crow in so many ways. I mean, and much of it is due to your own, the scope of your research and the beauty of the writing. I mean, you tell some really vivid, kind of on the ground stories, but it's also woven into a really careful historical and political and sociological analysis. It's a great piece of work. But it's also the case that travel turns out to be kind of the site for really seeing how Jim Crow worked. It's just astonishing what you've uncovered. So can you just talk a little bit about where you started with this project and what were some of your own discoveries along the way as the project grew?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This was a totally unplanned book. It was something that I sort of got curious about and started to research while working on other projects. And it just kept growing and growing and growing, and eventually became a book. And I guess what made me curious about it was the way that travel wove into the lives of African Americans I was studying. My training and a lot of my work has been in intellectual history. So I was looking at thinkers like Ida B. Wells, and Ida B. Wells really became an activist and developed this critique of Jim Crow initially after being kicked out of a ladies' car on the railroad, and which sort of made her think about both race and gender in what would be really innovative ways. That was true of a lot of women, including the women featured in the edited collection I did with Farrah Griffin, Martha Jones, and Barbara Savage towards an intellectual history of Black women. So, I sort of pursued those kinds of experiences, and I became very curious about, what happens when you get new forms of transportation. You go from trains to buses to cars to airplanes. And I began to research it. It initially was sort of just a kind of research project where I was sort of trying to trace that. And I was tracing it through looking at people's experiences mostly, because what I found when I read the existing history was mostly it was legal cases, but they didn't tell me what was happening on the ground. I sort of tried to map that out and found that, stories about travel was everywhere. Resistance to segregation on transportation was everywhere. And the sort of aspects of how new technology was adapted to Jim Crow were sort of fascinating and largely unrecognized. So there were sort of amazing surprises every chapter. For instance, it took me a long time of studying people's experiences on trains to begin to understand that there was a phenomenon known as the Jim Crow train crash. I saw a lot of sort of counting of how many people died in train crashes, and it took me a while to realize this was because as the technology in passenger cars was updated, they went from wood to metal, they would just rotate the wood cars into the Jim Crow section. So by the early 20th century, we'd get these train crashes where every car on the train except the Jim Crow car was metal. And when there was a train crash, which were pretty common in the early 20th century, virtually all the injuries and deaths would be in the Jim Crow car. So these kind of discoveries were fascinating. The fact that there was segregated seating for at least a while on airplanes was, something that I hadn't necessarily expected to find. The whole sort of history of how buses worked was fascinating, and details of even driving. There was a kind of racial right-of-way that they experimented with in the Deep South for a while, where they initially thought that maybe driving rules should go by race. So with a stop sign, Black people should wait until all the white people had proceeded. Obviously, this didn't work very well at four-way stops when there was sort of no orderly racial arrangement for drivers. So this didn't last very long, but just the way in which racial hierarchy pervaded transportation was sort of fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and the racial right-of-way only probably didn't work because there were always white drivers behind the Black driver, right?
Exactly. That's why it didn't work.
Their rights were being impeded. Yeah.
Exactly.
So can you talk a little bit? I mean, I reading the book and knowing you and knowing something about what it's like to research a topic like this, I just thought this was probably a study that was expanding before your very eyes as you got further and further into it. At what point did you realize that travel was going to be a kind of lens on the whole phenomenon of racial hierarchy and Jim Crow practice?
I think I realized that pretty early on, but it took me a long time to kind of decide why travel was something that everyone, why travel segregation was something that everyone opposed. I mean, across the lines of political commitment. You know, Marcus Garvey is a Black separatist, but he's opposed to the Jim Crow car. Booker T. Washington is a accommodationist, but he lobbied against the Jim Crow car. So it was like, why is this such an important issue to everybody? And then it also took me a long time to figure out, you know, begin to think about why travel is so crucial, which I think has to do with the ways in which the transportation revolution coincides, you know, with the beginnings of segregation. And it, you know, transportation creates these kind of domestic spaces where strangers encounter each other in a newly urbanizing, newly mobile world. And it is just, it makes travel into a very, very explosive site for social interactions.
The scope of the study is just, I mean, it's huge, the tapestry that you've woven here. And I mean, so you make the Plessy decision is kind of the end of a story, but it's also the beginning of another story. And this is a study that just spans the, you know, the latter 19th century all the way to the present. And it's a study that completely shakes up both our temporal and our geographical frame on understanding Jim Crow. That is, your book argues that Jim Crow is neither past nor South. Can you talk a little bit about those two things, about expanding the temporal and geographical frame and some of the things you learned about events outside of the kind of the high Jim Crow period, or let's say the low Jim Crow period, and also the North. The North plays a really important role here.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely talk about that. In terms of expanding the chronology, I mean, one of the things that got me interested in sort of researching further is that to the extent that people had sort of written much about travel Jim Crow, the story often kind of ended with Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous case that establishes the doctrine of separate but equal. It's a case that people sometimes even forget was a railroad case. To the extent it bears on transportation, people are kind of like, and after that, everything was segregated. But if once you look at the historical record, Plessy is continuously under challenge by Black litigants, even long after Plessy. Plessy does not actually require segregation in interstate transportation. That is because that's under the Interstate Commerce Commission. So, and interstate commerce is governed by under the Constitution. So there's always that kind of way in which Plessy doesn't apply to interstate travel. So you have litigants challenging it. And then you also have a transportation network that is not limited by region, and various Jim Crow things extend up to the North in ways that are both obvious and non-obvious. For instance, people were often put in the Jim Crow car as far north as Chicago and as far west as Los Angeles. Other forms of kind of informal segregation took place all over the country. And, you know, some of the most sort of interesting Jim Crow logic and certainly the interesting Jim Crow laws come out of the South, but the actual experience is something that people are encountering everywhere, or as Leadbelly would say, you find some Jim Crow everywhere you go.
Yeah.
I wanted to capture, to the extent that I was following people's experiences, the book tries to actually capture that.
Yeah. No, I was really surprised to learn that if a train was traveling from New York, but was eventually going to cross through Virginia, they Jim Crowed the passengers in New York.
I was amazed, and I was even more amazed, and I found this out really late when I was kind of like, okay, well, what about all the other destinations? And I came across something where Langston Hughes talks about being Jim Crowed in Los Angeles on a train bound for Louisiana, which I subsequently found not uncommon. But it makes a certain amount of sense for the trains that are starting out with a certain number of cars. On other cars, they would make people move to a different car or possibly a different train. There was kind of a big change that sometimes went on in DC where everyone sort of got off their train that had come from the north and got on a new train configured to travel south. But other places, they just put people in the Jim Crow car early, or in the case of buses, they put people in the back of the bus going out of New York or Chicago.
That's also, I mean, one of the richnesses of this study is that you're able to really show how legal segregation, de jure segregation, and de facto segregation really worked hand in glove. And so you have laws or local ordinances or Jim Crow legislation. You have corporate policies, but you also just have the one-off kind of racist behavior of like the railroad conductor or the bus driver or the roadside waitress or gas station attendant. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned about, I think of it as kind of the density of the fabric of Jim Crow logic and the way it works at all these different levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in some of the earliest Jim Crow, the Jim Crow that takes shape in the antebellum North before you have anything like a Jim Crow law. Part of the issue for a lot of the people who are enforcing things like having Black people ride on top of the stagecoach or on the outside of the steamboat or in what comes to be called the Jim Crow car, part of it is about the challenge that white working class conductors and stagecoach drivers and steamboat officials can feel about being in a position where they would actually be serving a formerly enslaved population. Part of the challenge that travel poses to the American social fabric is it kind of mixes up the racial hierarchy. There are middle-class Black travelers who might have to be served by white bus drivers. And all of this is something that in the South, the system is really designed to avoid. And that remains an issue in a lot of places. And in the South, it's sort of accentuated by the fact that Blacks are generally not, during the segregation era, hired to do things like drive buses or be the train's conductor instead of the porter. So people will enforce it on that level. And then there's very interesting questions around what the businesses think they're doing. I mean, at some point, there is a perception, I think, among a lot of corporate entities that Jim Crow is something that is required by the customers, so that they are willing to enforce Jim Crow practice even when the South begins to roll back some of those laws, or not roll back, but actually they get defeated in court. They move to get the carriers to do it, and the carriers do it because they're told that nobody will want to travel if there's no Jim Crow.
Right. It's like the Southern affiliates in the TV network system, or the Southern film distributors who were always acting on behalf of some imagined white Southern audience who just couldn't take any kind of desegregationist practice at all. But it's presumed, and it's enforced from the top, but always on behalf of some broader public that's out there.
And it's thought to be, a rational profit motive. It's not clear it always is. There was sort of enormous inconveniences to having something like a colored car, but the railways would try to get around that by putting very minimal resources into the colored car, which is why you have these old wooden cars and, these sort of very suboptimal. One of the reasons why they're such suboptimal spaces is that very little money is spent on what otherwise might be an expensive practice.
Especially in the South, but not exclusively so. One of the things that's at the heart of Jim Crow's really violent kind of undertow and its cruelty is that on the one hand, it's completely rigid and unforgiving, but on the other hand, it's completely capricious and highly variable from one place to another. So So one could never know, like what you were walking into in a certain locale, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what are the local customs here, what's going to happen when I arrive, when my train arrives in New Orleans or Atlanta or whatever, what world am I entering? Can you talk a little bit about that the kind of, the cruelty is of a piece, but it's made up of inconsistencies in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I ultimately came to understand why it was so widely resented was that you couldn't defend yourself against it. You couldn't decide, for instance, that you weren't going to violate the rules of Jim Crow because they varied from one place to another, even from one town to another sometimes, so that, a lot of the people who end up in court or sometimes in jail didn't intend to be there. They weren't taking deliberate stands. They simply, bought a ticket that they thought should allow them to travel in a certain compartment and were told they couldn't. And that was one of the reasons why it was just something that people resented so widely, was that it was kind of impossible to honor it, even if you were trying to not offend anybody. And then it also kept changing with the technology, with the current practice. For instance, airports were initially not segregated, and then as they're being built in the 50s, airports all of a sudden start to become segregated, but not all of them, and not in a consistent way. Sometimes it's the bathroom and not the waiting room. Sometimes it's vice versa. And as one Black traveler said, you never know when you're going to be like washing your face in the sink and someone's going to hit you in the head because you're in the wrong bathroom. So it was just a tremendously difficult, really impossible system to navigate. And many people said that the worst of it was the kind of uncertainty it imposed on travelers, which I think was particularly hard because travel always imposes a certain level of uncertainty on us. We never know how long it's going to take to get someplace, how uncomfortable the seat will be, whether we'll be able to, get something to eat on the road. And all these things actually end up mattering.
Yes. No, and the residual effect of these, long-time practices is still very much with us. I remember our colleague Jonathan Holloway talking about, growing up in the 70s, and his father, when they went anywhere in the car, was always insistent, you have to go to the bathroom before we leave because we might not be able to stop anywhere, right? There might not be a safe place. And so this is like, one would think, or we've been taught to think, this is a generation after the fact, but no, it's still very much part of the culture and part of the kind of the vigilance of traveling Black.
Yes, and I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest African Americans still don't travel as freely or comfortably or even as often as white Americans, for reasons that have to do with these kinds of traditions, as well as ongoing and new forms of racism and things like the sharing economy of Airbnb, Uber, Lyft. Early evidence is really suggesting that a lot of the same old kind of discrimination exists in these new forms of.
Yeah, I want to get to the kind of succession of modes of travel. So there's like, there's obviously it's a very messy history and there's a lot of overlap and it's not linear, but there's kind of basically like the railroad era, the automobile era, and the the flight era. We have a question from the audience that kind of gets us into this. And by the way, I just want to invite everyone to post questions into the chat, if you would. We want to open up this discussion. But here's a comment on the Green Book. There's been a study done of Black travel related to the roads and rest stops that Southern Blacks could use safely. They showed up as travel guides. I believe they were called Green Books or Green Maps. Did you come across this? Cartographic historians have made some significant advances in revealing this history because as travel by automobile came to overtake rail transport, there were actually safe maps created for the Black automobile traveling population.
Yeah, I talk about the Green Book, and I also talk about the many other Green Books. One of the interesting things is the Green Book has sort of captured everyone's imagination, but it was one of several guides used by Black travelers. They date as far back as the 30s as actual publications, and they start with something called Hackley and Harrison's Guide that was first published in 1929. And then by the 50s and 60s, you have a whole bunch: the Go Guide, Travel Guide. The Green Book seems to have been the most widely published and widely used, though I think that probably it was still more common not to use a book. And these are fascinating, and people have been using them to map things. I think one of the things I emphasize in my book is that we can't overestimate the kind of safety that they provided. For one, they were often they could be a little bit out of date. People who used them complained that the hotel that they were directed to was now a whorehouse or did not exist anymore. So that was a challenge. They also didn't cover everywhere. There were simply a lot of places where African Americans really had no place to stay. They were useful, and they were kind of an extension of an existing culture of sort of African Americans exchanging information about where you could go. Victor Green, who started the Green Book, was a mailman, and one of the reasons he thought of starting it is that one of the things that people sometimes did to find out where they could stay was stop the Black mailman and ask him, where are the Black restaurants, where's the Black neighborhood, where can I go? He was also someone whose brother-in-law was a musician, and Black musicians passed around lists of where you could stay, so he drew on that tradition as well.
Mm-hmm. We found that when I was working on the documentary about the desegregation of baseball, we found players talking about, especially in the minor league circuits, traveling in, the Florida League or the Southern League, in places for the most part you didn't want to be. But they stayed in funeral homes. They stayed in just all kinds of places, while their white teammates, of course, were put up in the best hotel in town. They were still staying often in boarding houses, but sometimes in funeral parlors or any kind of Black owned business that had a place for people to roll out on the floor. It was just part of the deal in kind of what that world that they entered as they were doing that work of desegregation.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes Black female musicians, or even there was a Black female baseball player, they would actually stay in the whorehouses because this was a sort of friendly female environment for them to stay.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the Green Book question urges us towards is this history of the succession of dominant modes of travel, and how, on the one hand, I mean, it's really striking that each time there's a change in travel technology, there's a moment of hope in the African American community, but each time Jim Crow adapts in one way or another, or is adapted in one way or another. So can you just kind of walk us through kind of from railroad to automobile to bus to airlines?
Yeah, no, that's a very strong theme in the book, because there is this tremendous hope around new forms of transportation, and African Americans are often kind of early adapters of new forms of transportation because they hope to find a freedom in it. And that begins, well, it actually begins even with the railroad, when people hope that the railroads will be not have a Jim Crow car, and that doesn't last for very long. And then by the time you begin to get the automotive engine and cars and buses, the railroad has sort of established itself. As the Jim Crow car has really become almost a kind of just a metaphor for second-class citizenship. Du Bois says, to be Black is to have to ride Jim Crow in Georgia. That sort of defines, the humiliation and the second-class citizenship. So people look to cars and buses, and with reason. I mean, the car is initially greeted by virtually everyone as freeing, as something that is a purely private vehicle where you can come and go as you please and you have to defer to nobody. But certainly as cars become useful for something like long distance transportation, they stop being private. I mean, we think of them as private, but to use a car, you rely on a network of services, from gas stations to hotels to rest stops. And as this network of services develops, African Americans once again find themselves on the outside. And this parallel story happens with buses, where African Americans, when it comes to long distance buses, often get shut out because early bus lines didn't even want to carry Black people, because where would they go to the bathroom? Could they eat at the rest stop? All of these things would have to be litigated one way or another. And in each case, African Americans would have to sort of fight for full access to these new forms of transportation, always with mixed success.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a powerful symbolic level to this too, I think, I would say on both sides of the color line, that the surveillance and policing of Black movement goes deep into the antebellum culture, right? And that still is very much with us. I'd love to hear your comment on that. But on the other side, I do think that there's something really symbolically powerful about movement as a kind of embodiment of what freedom means. And so, this is another piece of the baseball research we did. One of the most common, it's a two-part story, but it was very common. We heard it from a lot of different people. When these young ball players signed their first professional contract, first thing they did was buy a car. Second thing that happened was the car was vandalized.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's like, there's something really powerful about the idea of the freedom that travel affords. And maybe the role of the automobile in American culture as well.
Yeah, I think it's literal. I think movement is literally kind of crucial to Black freedom for most of the, most of the period of time this book covers. With the end of the Civil War, emancipation for many African Americans literally involves moving somewhere else and finding a way to do that. Seeking the freedom to do so. There is from very early on interest in controlling the movements of Black people. And then in the 20th century, you have these waves of migration. I remember a cranky, very early reader of this book was like, well, African Americans don't travel. And I'm like, but what if the Great Migration? People were on the road constantly, and they were often traveling in pursuit of some kind of greater freedom and opportunity, jobs in the North and so forth. So their understanding of travel is absolutely crucial, was quite literal. And then it was also a period of time in which African Americans were sort of going from a predominantly Southern population to becoming a national population. So among the people who had trouble on the road were leaders who were kind of crisscrossing the country, creating national Black organizations, the NAACP, for instance, creating a sort of national Black community. So this movement is sort of crucial to creating a community, and it's sort of done under these very difficult circumstances. And that's part of what really defines the African American experience. I think you had another question, which I may have forgotten.
Well, I wanted to kind of continue our march through time here on the timeline. Okay. So we went from railroad to automobile. What about from automobile to the air travel era? Because one of the surprises here, well, there are a couple. One is, we think in our kind of succession of modes of travel, we think of air travel being mostly kind of a post-50s or even post-60s phenomenon, which indeed it is. But you find that there are kind of stereotypes about African Americans in flight going all the way back to the 1930s, and how air travel and airplanes represent a technology that African Americans are just totally unsuited for. So there's this long-standing kind of discourse, but then you find that once air travel, commercial air travel is really, there's an infrastructure for it and it's becoming more common. In some ways, it's actually worse than some of the ground travel in terms of what what might happen to one as they were making their way from one city to the next.
Yeah, no, air travel was fascinating to me. I actually started with that chapter because I wasn't actually sure how much one could say about it, just because I had never read anything about it. But what I found is that this sort of air travel story highlighted a theme that's seen in earlier forms of transportation, this idea that African Americans were ill-suited to certain kinds of technology. So even before you had commercial air travel, there was some idea that African Americans would not be able to fly, they wouldn't be comfortable passengers, and some of the earliest commercial flights simply didn't take Black passengers. And we also had rhetoric from people like Charles Lindbergh about, this is a white technology. It's sort of literally, I think another guy said, Negroes cannot fly. So that sort of shapes from the beginning, and it extends to like who can use airfields, who can learn how to fly, who is allowed in the Air Force. So that there's a sort of story with flying that begins, with airfields and individual flyers, and then kind of trickles into commercial air, where in early commercial flights, you have first an attempt to keep Black passengers out, then an attempt to relegate them to particular seats, and always, as in other forms of segregation, it's kind of the worst seat on the plane. So early Black flyers often had to sit in the front seat, which was the seat that was close to the propeller, and subjected whoever sat in it. It was a single seat into a sort of display of pyrotechnics, which could be a little terrifying and also very loud. Eventually you got airlines trying to shepherd their relatively small number of passengers to the same row of seats. This actually happened to my mother, by the way, in the 1950s. I once asked her, long before this book, what her first flight was like. And she was like, what was really weird about it is there was only 2 Black people on the plane, and I sat next to the other one, and we were both like, oh. But I later came to understand that this is what they did. They sort of moved everyone into the same area, especially on flights that departed or went to the South. All of this was part of it, but then there was also this pattern of segregation on the ground that emerged that I referenced earlier that could make it worse than driving or taking the train, because you could go to the great expense at a time when flying was still pretty expensive, of getting an airplane ticket and get to the airport, get to your destination. And if it was in a southern town, you might have to take a Black or a white cab, but the Black cab wouldn't necessarily be at the airport. So you then land at the airport and the whole fast trip immediately slows down because you cannot cab. And these kind of things also occurred when there were layovers, stops for equipment problems, buses sort of taking people part of the way. There weren't that many Black flyers, especially in the early days of flying, but those that there were often got stuck places in the midst.
Yeah, you tell a harrowing story of, I think is it Jackie Robinson? And
Jackie Robinson.
Flying and getting stalled in New Orleans. Do I have this right?
He got stalled all the way. He was traveling from LA to spring training in Florida, and he got stalled he got bumped in one city and put on a bus in another. At no point could he and his wife get any food. So they happened to be traveling with sandwiches that his parents had given them, and sort of embarrassed them by giving them sandwiches at the airport, but they ended up having to sort of eat them the entire way across. So yeah, the problem of getting food, having a place to stay could become really problematic at a time when airplane trips could be very complicated and involve different legs. There was also the phenomenon Black travelers were bumped, and this happened to Ella Fitzgerald in Hawaii, which might not sound like a terrible place to be bumped off out of your plane, but she and 2 of her fellow a band member and a personal assistant were bumped off a plane to make room for white travelers in Hawaii. And they never even got their sweaters or purses. They were just told they couldn't get back on. The plane continued on to Australia, where she was supposed to give a concert, and she missed her concert. and ultimately sued and won. But this kind of experience was not uncommon for Black flyers.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that suit and to the long history of similar suits and other kinds of resistance, and maybe that'll be a more hopeful place for us to end this conversation. But there are a few waypoints along the way that I want to make sure we hit. One is you talked about finding a place to stay, and I would love to hear you. You touch on this briefly in the book, and it's a really important phenomenon, and I think a lot of people don't know about. Can you talk about sundown towns?
Oh yeah, sundown towns are towns that have either driven out their Black population or have never had one and sort of committed to not having African Americans. And some of them would actually put up signs saying that Blacks should not let the sun set on them in the town. And they're all over the country, not just in the South. In fact, they might be more common in the Midwest, but they're also in New Jersey. And this was one of the liabilities that Black travelers had to kind of find their way around and make sure to avoid. And this was one reason why you had, so many African American travelers who would drive at night, because you just don't ever want to stop in a sundown town. So this is sort of a long tradition, and it illustrates the truly sort of unpredictable dangers for Black travelers, and yet another reason why they might want to use something like the Green Book that would sort of let them know whether towns had facilities that were open to Black people.
Right. There's an amazing interview with the comedian Roy Wood Jr. I think it's Terry Gross, actually, where he's talking about early in his comedy career, kind of traveling the kind of second-rate circuits, mostly in the South. And he said, he would, when he got a gig, he would look at a map and decide what his strategy was, and he would figure out like how far is this town from the blue highways, which he thought of relatively safe. And if it was far off the path, he said, I would book a hotel somewhere way far away from that, and I would drive in and I would park at the venue. I would do my gig. I would get in the car and I would leave as quickly as I could and make it back to the blue highway and to some hotel like hours away. And that was the 1990s. And I just think, especially white Americans are just not aware of that level of vigilance still being part of life in the US.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are still kind of committed to the interstate, which, these sort of main highways, and a lot of people have these kind of concerns about where you go.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions rolling in. I want to encourage more. Can you say something about the streetcar? And I read when federal interstate highways were being planned, people in Macon, Georgia wanted to build separate segregated highways. Crazy?
Crazy. There was certainly, I think I've seen, there was talk of that. There was a sort of imagined possibility of segregated everything. So yeah, that's not crazy, but of course the resources to do that were never going to be expended. Though in certain ways, highways ended up, in many ways, highways ended up segregating people, not the least because they're more used by whites than Blacks. More whites are car owners, more whites travel by highway. So yeah, not entirely crazy. The streetcars are fascinating. The streetcar is a really major site for battles over Jim Crow. There's that big wave of Black streetcar boycotts in the early 20th century. I do not actually discuss them much in the book because I'm mostly concerned with long distance travel, and the streetcar boycotts are very deeply rooted in sort of municipal politics, in particular, the stories of particular states. But the streetcars are tremendously important. And they represent a sort of really striking moment of Black political activism in which people who are in neighborhoods that have actually been kind of separated before the streetcar emerged to pull those neighborhoods together, or really try to work together in places like, Philadelphia and many other towns to overturn streetcar segregation and succeed in the North, but fail in the South. So streetcars are really important, and Blair Kelly's The Right to Ride really chronicles the streetcar stories very well.
Yeah, but even though you don't focus on that kind of transportation so much, what does emerge from your work is that, of course, the Plessy case is a railroad case, and of course, the Montgomery bus boycott is about buses. I mean, it's transportation kind of all the way through. If it's a real reframe of the long civil rights era in a certain way. I don't know if you found that in your research or how deeply you felt that as you were kind of uncovering this stuff. But it's
I absolutely felt that. I mean, I got deep into the NAACP papers. Which even though the NAACP decided, in the 30s after the Depression, when it sort of lost a lot of its money, that it really couldn't take on transportation cases, it has thousands and thousands of letters by Black travelers, can you do anything? This is my experience on a bus. This is my experience on a train. This is my experience on a plane. It is, it's an issue that just won't go away. And a lot of the cases that we see are cases that the NAACP gets dragged into because people just insist that this is a absolutely crucial issue. And it is probably because it is where most people are experiencing the most direct and unavoidable breach of their civil rights, other than in the schools.
Right. But even, I mean, there's some internal debates that are very interesting. I mean, some of the cases that you find where the anti-Jim Crow resistance is actually incredibly limited. And there are a lot of kind of strategic debates over like what's the proper point of entry on these issues. I mean, you get that even in Montgomery, actually.
Well, I mean, I think especially in the municipal cases, it's really complicated. People kind of, whether it's, whether there's a status quo, whether we can kind of just ask for amelioration, but that's always a debate. I mean, the NAACP at various points is sort of fighting with Black activists in the South who want the NAACP to help them put pressure on the railroads to at least provide decent Jim Crow facilities. And you have Thurgood Marshall saying, no, we can't do that because that would accept segregation. And they're saying, but you don't know what it's like to have to, travel in these situations. So there's a kind of continuum of what people think they can hope for and what they think they can achieve that, makes for very complicated debates.
Yeah. Here's another question. I often think that segregation is gravely misunderstood in the American consciousness as being about limiting access of Black people to white space, as opposed to being a system of policing Black people's movements geographically, politically, and economically, and deputizing the white masses in the enforcement of anti-Blackness at all levels of society. Question: what misconceptions do you think persist in our popular ways of thinking about segregation? And in your process of writing this book about Black travel, what shifts in your own impressions stick out to you?
Well, one of the things I really wanted to get out there was I think, among the many of us who have not experienced Jim Crow, there is sometimes the idea that, segregation was about separation and, Black people with Black people, white people with white people, maybe there was something to it, but in addition to the surveillance, the segregated space to which African Americans were relegated was always manifestly inferior. It was systematically so. There was kind of a commitment to making it, making the colored waiting room smaller, using less cleaning staff, or sometimes not providing at all. It was, a way of kind of inscribing racial hierarchy into the landscape. In ways that kind of echoed the racial, or made manifest the racial hierarchy that existed in politics. And I think it's really important that people understand it. And I think that it's difficult for people to understand it because this is one of the things that has kind of disappeared. We don't see the colored and white signs anymore. Many people don't really know what those facilities look like. So I really wanted to emphasize that. And I was amazed by sort of how consciously and systematically, the sort of inferior space of segregation was created, and how there was a real commitment to maintaining it, even to the point of kind of making it clear to the colored janitor who cleaned the washrooms in the Atlanta terminal that you shouldn't actually clean the colored washroom all that often.
Right. And there's also, and we touched on this earlier, but there's a kind of terror always just beneath the surface, because these codes are so, on the one hand, kind of inscrutable and capricious, but so unforgiving. And so there's always, the Jim Crow codes are just always a sign of danger in some way. That seems to me to be ever present. I don't know if you thought about it that way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the southern states, gave bus drivers and conductors police powers to enforce Jim Crow, and even whites who did not have police powers were often kind of expected and permitted to enforce various forms of Jim Crow. So it was sort of part of a certain kind of wage of whiteness, part of the ways in which the society, made it clear what the distinctions were. And we have its echo today, certainly in modern day traffic stops, in the ongoing discrimination faced by Black travelers, all of which, kind of underscores the hierarchies within our society.
Yeah. So this brings us, here's another question. This is, I mean, it's very practical, but also it's just like a really deeply philosophical and theoretical question. What precautions should be taken today? I'm interested in becoming a Fulbright scholar, but mostly fear has halted my process.
Precautions as a traveler, many of the traditional precautions, the time for them has not ended. People need to research their routes, talk to other travelers about their experiences, find out where they should go, where there's safe, where there'll be safe harbor. Today, there's not necessarily any green book, though actually someone has published something called the Green Book, but the internet has actually become a source of information where Black travelers share information. And the kind of precautions that African Americans who drive a car should take are, here I think we are in similar circumstances that people were during the Jim Crow era. The people who get into traffic stops and get into trouble with police, it's very difficult for anyone to be cautious enough to be subject to some sort of pretextual traffic stop with some policeman who may or may not, kind of keep it together. But people have to be very much aware of that, and look out for areas in which this is frequent, like Ferguson, for example, which had and still has an incredibly bad record of traffic stops.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, this is where our deep history of racial inequity intersects with our more recent history of neoliberalism, because a lot of locales really count on the traffic stop and the ticketing to keep the coffers full in their cities and towns. And so that kind of broken windows policing is just part of the way that revenue is generated in a society that has decided that we just aren't interested in taxation anymore. Right.
And then we're also going to take the money from those that can at least afford to share it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so far we haven't quite held to my hope that we would end up on an optimistic note, which isn't so surprising. This is 2021. But I do feel like, your book has so much to say about Black resistance and about the kind of the ingenuity of Black resistance and the resilience and just the tireless work that has gone into the struggles for justice, over a century and a half and more. I mean, and that's just after emancipation. Can you say anything about kind of your own conclusions, having wrapped up this project, your own conclusions about kind of the state of play in African-American politics right now, and the the important lessons about the struggle that you have now kind of witnessed through your research.
Well, I think the things I witnessed was about, what a long game it was. I mean, people fought for 100 years at least to kind of achieve some of the travel civil rights that are now in place. And there's a way in which certain kinds of discrimination reinvents itself, but I don't think we should discount this sort of tremendous victory achieved by civil rights activists, the freedom riders, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the sort of getting rid of formal segregation. That was a tremendous victory that required an enormous fight, and it required all kinds of activism. That was one thing that really struck me. We sometimes, today, as in the past, we see a lot of arguments about, like, should it be direct action? Should it be in the courts? This kind of action is good, this kind of action is not bad. But in the end, with travel, it took everything. It took direct action, it took legal action, it took theorization, teaching of history. So, the important thing was, that people do something, and I think that will continue to be important for people to kind of pursue all kinds of action and activism, and to try to imagine, a future in which things are better, and to think about the ways to get there. So there's, people today talking about how we should get rid of traffic stops just generally, like there ought to be a way to ticket people for minor traffic infractions in ways that they have to pay. It affects the renewal of their registration. But, people have to think of imaginative ways to make this stop and fight for them. Sometimes they seem like a long shot, and a lot of what we've achieved today seemed like a long shot to people a long time ago. So it's a very long, very difficult game. But we know that people in the past have actually made strides. So I think we have to continue the fight.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that moral of the story, kind of all hands on deck. Every
Yes.
kind of work is needed. So, do what you can do, understand who you are and what you're capable of, and then push that, and don't worry about whether there are more important things to be doing. Do what you can.
Yes.
And the other piece, I mean, this is one of my favorite quotes from a SNCC worker, talked about, this was about the voter registration campaigns in the early 60s, talked about the revolutionary patience involved in doing that kind of work. And I just love that formulation, because we think of revolution as being impatient, but I think it's actually the opposite. I think revolutionary patience is just what it takes for this kind of struggle.
Yeah, I think the most heroic activists are certainly those that, like the Ella Bakers, the Ida B. Wells, that just keep on fighting through periods in which it seems like they're not winning anything at all.
Right. Well, Mia Bay, it's just been a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for this work that you've done, and thanks for spending time with us tonight. It's been great to hear more about your thinking on this, and it's such important work. So thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Again, we hope to see you in person someday. I don't know when that might be. But I do want to say just a quick program note. This is our last program of this semester, but we have a full slate for next semester. The schedules will be posted on the Public Humanities and New Haven Free Public Library websites in the coming days. But just a preview, we have Crystal Feemster talking about envisioning Black citizenship before emancipation. We have Laura Briggs on how all politics became reproductive politics. We have Laura Barraclough on the politics of the National Parks heritage trails. We have Josh Glick on democracy in the age of fake news and deep fakes. We have Courtney Martin on democratizing museums, and our colleague from up the road at Wesleyan, Jennifer Tucker, on the Second Amendment and US gun culture. That's all next semester in the Democracy for America series. Thanks again for coming. Don't forget, we're still in a pandemic. Take care of yourselves, keep your guard up, take good care, and thanks again, Mia Bay.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.